Imagine facing winter with no fridge, no freezer, and no grocery store. Just a root cellar and whatever you managed to grow, hunt, or preserve before the snow hit. That was everyday life for early American settlers. If you didn't preserve what you had, you didn't eat. Simple as that. The wild part? Many of the methods they used still work today. No electricity needed, just basic ingredients, some planning, and a little grit. Here are 5 ways they kept food from spoiling, and how you can too. Salt curing. Back in the early days of American settlement, meat was a blessing and a problem. If you butchered an animal, you couldn't waste a single piece. But with no refrigeration, keeping it from spoiling wasn't easy. That's where salt curing came in. It wasn't just a technique, it was a lifesaver. Salt was more than seasoning. It pulled the moisture out of meat, which meant bacteria couldn't grow. Settlers would take slabs of pork, strips of venison, or whole fish, and pack them in layers of coarse salt. Sometimes they'd mix in sugar or pepper for flavor, but the real goal was preservation. The meat would sit in barrels or crocks, soaking in its own brine for days or even weeks. The result? Food that could last for months, even without cold storage. It wasn't gourmet, and it was definitely salty, but it worked. People would boil the salt pork to make it edible, or slice it up and fry it in a pan. In a stew, it added fat and flavor to whatever scraps you had left. Today, salt curing is still used by home butchers and off-grid homesteaders. All you need is good salt, a clean container, and time. If you're curing meat at home, make sure to research safe ratios and handling, because while the method is old, the safety rules are real. But the core idea, it's timeless. When the power goes out or the freezer breaks, salt still does the job. Root cellars. Before fridges and freezers, settlers didn't panic when summer ended. They headed underground, literally. The root cellar was their version of cold storage. No wires, no buttons. Just a hole in the ground lined with stone, packed with shelves, and filled with whatever could last the winter. It sounds simple, but this method was incredibly effective. The basic idea was to use the Earth's steady temperature to preserve food. Deep enough below the surface, the soil stays cool but doesn't freeze. Perfect conditions for vegetables like potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, and beets. These crops didn't need fancy techniques. They just needed darkness, cool air, and a little moisture. Settlers would lay straw between layers of produce, stack everything on wooden racks or directly on the dirt floor, and check occasionally for rot. Some root cellars were full walk-ins dug into hillsides, while others were just deep pits covered with boards and a mound of earth. Both worked, and they didn't stop at veggies. Root cellars were also used to store jars of pickles, cured meats, barrels of cider, even butter in the cooler months. The best part? This method still works today. If you've got a basement, a buried trash can lined with straw, or a shaded corner of your yard, you can create your own version. People who garden or live off-grid swear by it, and once you realize how low-tech and reliable it is, you'll start to see why early settlers relied on it for generations. Pickling. When early American settlers had a good harvest, they didn't waste time celebrating. They got to work, because every overflowing basket of vegetables came with a deadline. Without refrigeration, fresh produce had a short life. So what did they do? They pickled it. Pickling was one of the most dependable ways to stretch a harvest deep into winter. The process was simple. Pack vegetables into a jar or crock, pour over a salty vinegar brine, weigh them down, and let time do the rest. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, effective, and gave food a whole new life. Cucumbers were the obvious choice, but settlers also pickled beans, onions, carrots, beets, and even fruits like peaches and watermelon rinds. The sour, salty flavor wasn't just about taste, it kept bacteria out and nutrients in. These pickled goods became crucial during winter months, when fresh greens were gone and meat was scarce. They were added to stews, eaten with cornbread or cured pork, or served cold alongside a bowl of hot beans. It was one of the few ways to keep vitamins on the table when nothing was growing outside. Today, pickling is still wildly popular, especially among gardeners, preppers, and food lovers. And it's easier than ever. No need for pressure canners or lab-grade equipment. Just clean jars, boiling vinegar, salt, and whatever vegetables you've got lying around. Some recipes use garlic and spices for flavor, but the base method hasn't changed in centuries. For settlers, pickling wasn't about gourmet snacking. It was about surviving the season and turning something fragile into something fierce. Smoking meat. Before refrigerators and vacuum sealers, early American settlers had to outsmart time and bacteria with fire and smoke. Smoking meat wasn't just about flavor, it was survival. When settlers butchered animals, they couldn't afford to lose anything. Salt curing helped, sure, but smoking gave food an extra layer of defense. It slowed spoilage, kept insects away, and made even the toughest cuts last longer. They'd build simple smokehouses out of logs or stone, often just a small shed with a vent in the roof and a fire pit inside. Meat was hung from beams or laid on racks above the smoke, and fires were kept smoldering, not flaming hot, but low and slow. Hickory, applewood, maple, or oak gave the meat that deep, smoky flavor we still love today. Pork was the most commonly smoked meat, especially bacon and ham, but settlers also smoked venison, fish, poultry, and even sausages. It wasn't just about taste, it was about security. Smoked meat could hang in a cool shed for weeks, sometimes months, especially when combined with salt. Today, smoking is still used by homesteaders, hunters, and backyard grill fanatics. Whether you've got a full-size smokehouse or a small smoker box on your grill, the method remains largely the same. It's slower than modern storage, but the reward is rich, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. For settlers, smoking meat was a skill that kept hunger at bay through the hardest months of the year, and the taste just happened to be unforgettable. Maple sugaring. In the early days of settlement, cane sugar was either too expensive or too far away. Honey wasn't always easy to come by, and molasses had to be shipped in. But in the cold forests of New England and the frontier, settlers found something sweet right in their backyard: maple trees. They learned the process of sugaring from Native Americans, who had been tapping trees and boiling sap for generations. The method was genius in its simplicity. Drill a hole into a sugar maple, insert a wooden spout, and collect the clear, watery sap that slowly dripped out. But the real magic happened over fire. Settlers would boil the sap for hours, sometimes days, reducing it down to a thick syrup, or even further, until it crystallized into maple sugar. Unlike syrup, maple sugar could be stored without spoiling. It was shelf-stable, easy to pack, and could be broken into chunks and used in baking, tea, or stews. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was fuel. A high-calorie source of energy during the coldest parts of the year, and a rare comfort in a time when food was more about survival than flavor. If you want to try sugaring today, it's still done almost exactly the same way. All you need is a sugar maple, a drill, a collection bucket, and a lot of time and patience. It takes around 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, but the process is deeply rewarding. For settlers, maple sugar wasn't a treat. It was one of the few luxuries they could make themselves, and a way to preserve the sweetness of spring for the long, hard months ahead. The early American settlers didn't have the luxury of wasting food or time. Everything they harvested, hunted, or raised had to last. And without modern tech or fancy packaging, they managed to feed entire families through harsh winters, dry summers, and unpredictable years. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The methods they used, salting, root cellaring, drying fruit, pickling, smoking, weren't just clever. They were tested, refined, and passed down because they worked. What's wild is that they still do. Whether you're prepping for emergencies, looking to waste less, or just curious about how people lived before electricity, these techniques still have a place. You don't need a full homestead or a smokehouse in the backyard to get started. Sometimes it's as simple as drying apple slices in your oven, or pickling a jar of cucumbers instead of tossing them. These weren't backup plans. They were the default way to survive, and in a lot of ways, they still make more sense today than ever. So maybe the next time your fridge is packed or your garden is overflowing, think like a settler and make it last.